The fall of the Berlin Wall at the end of 1989 marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War and the start of a new chapter in political policy at home and abroad. As the costly match between the United States and the crumbling Soviet Union came to an end, new global powers replaced the USSR as competitors on the world stage, and the US faced battles within over economic spending and political drama. When it comes to the general shift happening in global politics, the conflicts we see happening during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, not to be confused with his son, George W. Bush, are really reflective of larger underlying currents. President Bush Sr.'s reaction to China's crackdown on democracy set the stage for U.S. China relations today. The reduction of nuclear arms led to a drastic reduction of tension between the United States and what's now Russia, and the issue of oil at the center of the Persian Gulf War continues to dominate Middle East policies even today. In early June 1989, pro democracy demonstrators turned out in Tiananmen Square in the business center of Beijing, China. This particular demonstration followed a series of marches, hunger strikes, and other actions by student activists throughout the month of May, calling for educational reforms and free speech throughout the country. On June 4th and 5th, the government sent in the military, tanks, and the police to put down the protest, arresting nearly 10,000 people and killing several thousand more. Coverage of the massacre made its way to the U.S. by way of television. In 1980, newly created CNN boasted 24-hour news coverage, and because Mikhail Gorbachev was in Beijing for a summit in May, U.S. media was already there. So when the protests began, live coverage streamed into American homes, including coverage of the now famous Tank Man, who stood blocking military tanks in the middle of the road. Exactly what happened to him is still unknown. President Bush Sr.'s response to the Tiananmen Square massacre wasn't exactly the forceful response that many in the U.S., even Congress, hoped for or expected. There was no resounding speech in the form of Reagan's evil empire style, no take down this wall moment. For their part, Congress was split in initial reactions. More conservative and perhaps experienced members of Congress weren't totally surprised at China's crackdown on the protesters or their unwillingness to give in to the demands for liberalization of speech and education. After all, these Congress members were veterans of the Cold War. They didn't think that a communist stronghold like that would change. But more progressive and liberal members of Congress thought that perhaps the opening of trade that China accepted with Nixon's visit in 1972 and then later economic reforms in the later 70s would lead the country to accept some more liberal political ideals that went along with capitalist ideology. They were clearly wrong. In order to understand the frustrations of both political branches, though, in terms of action, we have to really understand their functions in this. From President Bush's side, he's working with the State Department to get intelligence on the ground during a very fast-moving and complicated and dangerous situation. And this is literally what the State Department does all the time, so he's going to rely on them to make most of the calls. And they only have so many people on the ground in China that they can work with, so they're really honestly probably doing the best that they can to get people home safely and negotiate things, but it's just not moving very fast because these things take people and they take time, and they just really don't have enough of either of those things. From the perspective of our Congress members, though, they've got constituents at home, the people that they're responsible to, who are calling them concerned about their family members who are in China, or maybe they have students at local colleges in their district who are Chinese students here on visas, who are now afraid for their lives if they return home. These people also have to make critical and time-responsive decisions. And so it's not necessarily that one side here is doing something particularly wrong, although if somebody was dropping the ball with the resources they did have, that would certainly be the case. But they are two groups of people in a tight situation who both need action and information in a very short amount of time. And when that's the case, there's always the tendency to blame the other side for not doing enough. And so, in the spirit of this, Congress is waiting around for what they think is Bush not doing anything, or at least not enough of something, in response to this atrocity, so they start drafting economic sanctions. In July, they passed the first set of sanctions. Quite a while later, a bipartisan group in Congress tried to pass additional sanctions that would link things like China's human rights policies to the amount that they would have to pay in the U.S. in tariffs. But Bush vetoed it because it interfered with trade too much. And so continuously today, we balance discussions of things like human rights violations, environmental regulations, free speech, and other things with our desire to trade in China. By the early 90s, the Cold War, as it had been defined for essentially 4 decades, was over. Arms limitation treaties in the form of SALT I and SALT II largely prevented more nuclear weapons from being built, borders opened between European nations, and the Soviet Union itself began dissolving into its component countries. One of the final pieces to the end of this long-winded conflict was START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which furthered the SALT treaties by actively reducing long-range warheads rather than just not making them anymore. For relations between the US and the Soviet Union, or by 1991, really just Russia, this was obviously a step in the right direction. But as we know from decades of engaging in the arms race, we weren't the only nations building nuclear weapons. And so what comes out of this more broadly is the need on the part of the United States to turn to other powers around the world that we see as threats, nations like North Korea, Iran, and China, and engage in discussions about how we plan to prevent conflicts with these nations. Because as we know full well, it doesn't take thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons to create devastation on a massive scale. We devastated Japan and killed millions of their citizens with just 2. And so this is where we get into discussions of using things like the UN to create global treaties on nuclear arms. And then for those treaties who won't participate in those kinds of agreements, places like North Korea, for example, we create very specific foreign relation policies about how we deal with those nations. Or in other cases, the US spends a lot of time and money and resources to prevent certain countries like Iran from creating atomic weapons. Because we can't take back the arms race or the Cold War. And so the global foreign policy that we're engaged with from this point onward is negotiating a path forward, knowing that half the world has the capability to kill the other half in a matter of minutes. This doesn't stop us from fighting just normal wars like we usually do, though. And when it comes to what we're fighting for, especially in the Middle East, things really just aren't very different. In the case of the Persian Gulf War, the US launched what's referred to as Operation Desert Storm after Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, invaded Kuwait for oil. Because 90% of the time when you're dealing with conflict in the Middle East, the answer is going to have something to do with oil at some point. The initial invasion by Saddam Hussein happened in early August 1990. Almost immediately, the U.S. sent in ships and aircraft in a defensive posture known as Desert Shield in order to prevent an attack. By November, the United Nations passed a resolution demanding the Iraqi leader leave Kuwait or be forced out by UN troops, and ultimately this was the outcome. From January 16th to February 28th, Operation Desert Storm drove Saddam Hussein out of the area. Although it was really primarily an Air Force endeavor, Desert Storm and the Gulf War in general is really significant in U.S. history as the first time that women at large have been called into active combat roles. The push was successful in driving Saddam from Kuwait, but it didn't topple his government or remove him from power. In March of 1991, uprisings within Iraq rose up against his regime, which were supported at least in voice by our government, but were unsuccessful in removing him from power after he used the military to squash the rebellions. And so, not toppled by UN troops or by the protests of his own people, Saddam Hussein continued as the leader of Iraq. In the mid-90s, he had 2 of his son-in-laws killed for defecting and revealing plans of weapons developments, and then another 2 of his sons were killed by UN troops in 2003 after President Bush Jr.'s ultimatum that Saddam stepped down as part of the global war on terror. He clearly didn't do this, as dictators never really do, and was captured, tried, and executed in 2006. But the 90s wasn't only about conflict on the world stage. The end of the Cold War, more efficient transportation, and the introduction of new technology like the internet led to the globalization of the economy. This globalization took the form of essentially a series of trade networks across the world that make free trade more simple and efficient. In 1993, for example, both Europe and North America created systems of free trade that would allow the countries in those continents to more effectively trade with each other without having to deal with as much bureaucracy. In Europe, the European Union, or EU, created a network of nations that use a common system or systems like customs forms, travel restrictions, business regulations, and even currency, the euro, in order to make business easier. This means that someone who travels between Spain and France and Germany can do so without having to carry 3 different currencies or worry about if the restaurants they eat at will have the same quality of cleanliness standards. This doesn't mean that countries in the EU have to necessarily give up uniqueness. They all still have their own currency, for example, but that they all make concessions on certain things to make interacting with each other easier. But certain countries might think that these concessions that they're making aren't worth it. Britain, for example, famously voted to leave the EU with Brexit in 2016. And in some ways, in 2020, they're still working on some of the aspects of how to disassociate their economy from the EU because it was so intertwined with it before. On the other side of the Atlantic, the US, Canada, and Mexico agreed to NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. The free trade part of this essentially meant that these countries would be able to trade with each other without dealing with tariffs. In July 2020, President Trump renegotiated NAFTA into the USMCA, which stands for US, Mexico, and Canada. This loosely does something similar but adds more protections for digital property. And then in 1995, the World Trade Organization was created to regulate international trade on a more global scale, in addition to pushing for fair competition between nations. They set up and interpret agreements between their member nations through roundtable discussions that are meant to foster transparency and are done in an all or nothing kind of format. People have to sit at the table until things are solved. This also helps foster economic reform in a sense because countries obviously don't want to be doing this kind of negotiation all the time. International conflicts and trade policies reflecting shifting global priorities were mirrored by domestic policies that showed the diversity of needs and debates within the United States in the 90s. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits discrimination federally based on disabilities that a person might have. This isn't the first federal law dealing with disability, mental or physical. In 1948, Truman created the National Institute of Mental Health. This was followed by a series of committees on disability research commissioned during the Kennedy administration, a decision perhaps impacted by the fact that Kennedy's sister Rosemary was intellectually disabled from complications at birth. The biggest step forward didn't really come until Section 504, though, in 1973, which provides for equal access and education for children with disabilities. The Netflix documentary Crip Camp shows the incredible journey that disability activists had to go through in order to get people to understand the kinds of things that they and their children experienced in school. And in the age of white mothers successfully using children as political props for all kinds of other political issues, it's fascinating that once these children are no longer able-bodied, people suddenly are less interested in the cause. Even after Section 504 passed, it wasn't enforced because the law itself didn't contain an enforcement mechanism. So it was up to local organizations, which are scattered and underfunded, if funded at all, to advocate for the children. This is why the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act was so important. The ADA provides clarifying language for previous disability legislation. But it also requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities and requires all buildings that serve the public to maintain certain accessibility standards. The specific requirement for what these building accessibility requirements would look like made the bill get caught up in Congress. Some legislators thought that the requirements as they were written were too strict. To show them the difficulties of accessing even the most iconic and supposedly democratic public spaces, disability advocates gathered at the Capitol steps and attempted to climb them without assistance, an event now referred to as the Capitol Crawl. Legislators who were on the fence about their position gave up and signed the bill. During his 1992 campaign, Bill Clinton promised to reevaluate the military's long-standing ban on homosexual service members. If you recall from our discussion of World War II, any men or women serving in the military that were found to be gay were given Section 8 blue discharges. These weren't necessarily dishonorable discharges, but they weren't honorable discharges either, which means that those servicemen and women didn't get GI Bill benefits after the war. With the increased integration of troops by race after Vietnam and then the influx of women into combat roles after Operation Desert Storm, advocates for greater equality in the military maintain that the institution's long-standing prejudice against LGBTQ+ service people had no place. Old-school military generals towed the line with the age-old argument that allowing homosexual individuals in the military would disrupt morale, which has always been a ridiculous argument because, one, LGBTQ service people have always been in the military, whether they realized it or not, and two, that's the same argument that they made about racial integration and women serving, and neither of those things seem to have sent the organization into disarray. But in a move of political expediency, because social conservatives in Congress threatened to block his legislation, Clinton chose to make a compromise, which is commonly referred to as don't ask, don't tell. As commander-in-chief, he issued a defense directive which in longer form actually said, quote, "A person's sexual orientation is considered a personal and private matter and is not a bar to service or continued service unless manifested by homosexual conduct." So essentially, unless there's some kind of evidence of homosexual conduct, people can't be asked about their sexual orientation. But in the next paragraph, they define homosexual conduct as, quote, a homosexual act, a statement by the applicant that demonstrates a propensity or intent to engage in homosexual acts, or a homosexual marriage or attempted marriage. So, by nature, people also can't admit to same sex attraction because that would fall under, quote, homosexual conduct. Hence, don't ask, don't tell. This obviously isn't a flawless compromise, and LGBTQ advocates argue that it's really not any better than what the system was before, because if LGBTQ service people can't talk about their sexual orientation at the risk of discharge, then how is that really much different than before? They argue that if LGBTQ service people want to serve their country, they should be able to do that just like everybody else without hiding who they are. And many service people didn't hide who they were. By 2008, 15 years after the order, over 12,000 officers had been discharged because of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Probably one of Clinton's greatest achievements, though, was the creation of a balanced budget by 1999. In the 1992 election, he tended to be really centrist on a lot of issues. This had a lot to do with attacks from social and cultural conservatives who looked at him as a weed-smoking Vietnam-dodging hippie from the 60s who was out to ruin America with his lefty policies. His Kennedy-esque way of approaching the sanctity of marriage didn't exactly help his image either. And so in an effort to curtail this image of himself as a leftist Democrat out to ruin the foundations of all that America stands for, he swung a lot of his social policies more conservative. He adopted a tough-on-crime stance and promised things like welfare reform. But where he remained really, truly very foundational Democratic, like the party, in his standards was the economy. Clinton had really essentially a populist message that while Reagan and Bush Sr. were out gallivanting around with their defense spending and then the actual military spending, like in the Gulf War, Americans at home were having to deal with the effects of all of this. Half the reason, or more really, that Bush Sr. didn't get reelected was because he literally said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and then he made new taxes. So Clinton rolls out this budget plan in 1993. It's wildly unpopular. And to be fair, it even goes against his own campaign promises, because he, like virtually every person running for office ever, promised to decrease taxes. But then when he looked at the budget and saw the potential to actually decrease the federal deficit or debt, he jumped on that. In order to do it, there would need to be a slight tax increase for normal people paired with cutbacks to federal spending. But virtually all of the Republicans in Congress who thought the only way to actually cut down the debt was to cut off the people causing the debt, i.e. government spending, they refused to support it. And so this went up for a vote, and it passed by literally the slimmest margin. But it does pass, and it worked. As you can see here in our chart, for a 4-year period, the government actually had a surplus. Of course, the benefits of this didn't really hit until the end of Clinton's time in office, so for the vast majority of the time that he was trying to make this work, especially taxing corporations at a high rate, he got a lot of criticism from the moneyed interests and Republicans, who, if you recall, prefer trickle-down economics, which gives tax breaks to those same corporations. This idea that Clinton's budget plan wasn't working, and especially that it wasn't working and he wasn't cutting back on government spending enough, at least according to Republicans in the government, was just a super bad combination when it came to trying to get his health care plan passed. Now, Republicans in Congress would have given him a hard time with this bill anyway, but the fact that they thought that he was just running away with the budget in 1993 just really didn't help things. It also didn't help that he put his wife, First Lady Hillary Clinton, in charge of the task force for the bill. Generally speaking, there was nothing wrong with the idea of the First Lady running a task force like this. We know that since the time of Eleanor Roosevelt, First Ladies have taken a much larger role in policy in the White House. The First Lady also wasn't just a First Lady in the sense that she wasn't new to politics or law or even the workings of Congress. In addition to being the First Lady of Arkansas while Bill was governor, she was a working lawyer. She also had experience advising the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives and served on the board of the Legal Services Corporation. For a lot of people, the precise problem with Hillary Clinton was all of these things. One of the attacks laid out against Bill Clinton during his 1992 campaign was that his wife was a working woman, that she represented a form of radical feminism that only furthered the idea of the kind of man that he was. The final problem with the healthcare plan, and really the only problem with the plan itself here, was that it was branded as a form of socialism. Which really, at this point, we should know that one, socialism is used as the boogeyman word to slap on anything we don't like in this country. And two, 99% of Americans clearly don't understand what socialism actually is. But we've seen this trend repeated throughout our history. When we didn't like labor unions in the Gilded Age, socialism. When we didn't like New Deal programs to end the Great Depression, socialism. When we didn't like the integration of schools, socialism and communism. When Truman and all of the other Democrats since him tried to pass health care plans essentially just like this one, socialism. All of this despite the fact that the plan presented here relied on private employer-based insurance companies to do the insuring and the forces of free market capitalism to drive down the prices. The only people who would be insured by the government would be the unemployed. But cries of socialism weren't the only criticisms of the bill. Small business owners, the same average people that Bill Clinton was meant to be representing with his economic and political policies, complained that they would be responsible for paying 80% of their employees' healthcare costs. For many, this just wasn't feasible. And so between the many waves of criticism, plus a well-financed media campaign against it, the bill deteriorated in Congress in 1994. The deterioration of the healthcare bill coincided with the 94 midterm elections. Republican Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich took this opportunity to create a stronghold for his party during the election cycle. Gingrich had already risen to a position of power within the party by using what would, until that point, be considered sort of unconventional tactics to gain support. He learned to harness new forms of political media like talk radio shows and C-SPAN, which for those of you who don't watch boring TV, streams Congress essentially 24/7. In particular, though, he made allies with new kinds of entertainment personalities like radio host Rush Limbaugh, who isn't a journalist but sort of grunge entertainer who stops short of what we would consider the basics of media ethics, like attacking the Clintons' then teenage daughter Chelsea on his show, even though historically presidents' minor children have been strictly off limits to the media. But this was Gingrich's new tool. He referred to more traditional forms of media as elitist media, a stepping stone for President Trump's attacks on the media as fake news. And in the 1994 midterm election cycle, he paired this new form of media, which he largely had control over in terms of messaging and language at least, with specific and calculated language to attack Democrats. In addition, Republicans focused on their new contract with America that focused on welfare rollbacks so that they could spend more on the defense budget, term limits, crime control measures, and a line item veto for the office of the president. The contract states, like Lincoln, our first Republican president, we intend to act with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, to restore accountability to Congress, to end its cycle of scandal and disgrace, to make us all proud again of the way free people govern themselves. As a taxpayer myself, this sounds amazing. Like, I would love for the federal government to stand up and say that they're going to start really looking into accountability measures to make sure that they crack down on scandal and make sure that we can be proud of the people that we elect to our institutions. Except that there were a few problems with this particular statement. First, we know that at this point, the Republican Party of 1994 was not the same as the Republican Party that Lincoln represented in his time. Given the shift in party issues from the 30s through the end of the 80s, Lincoln would be more aligned and more comfortable in most cases with the Democratic Party that Gingrich referred to in a 1995 memo as traitors. Second, what they're talking about here in terms of accountability in Congress is essentially Congress investigating congressional scandal. And anytime you have a group of people investigating themselves, it's not going to lead to a particularly insightful investigation. And then third, the idea that they're going to get rid of government scandal and disgrace is really kind of just laughable. I mean, for starters, President Clinton was having an affair with a White House intern, Miss Monica Lewinsky, this entire time. When this comes to light, he's not actually impeached for the affair itself. If we impeached presidents for having affairs, we'd have to create a separate Congress for making laws. The problem was that when he was directly asked about it under oath, he lied, which is perjury. And that is a crime. And so in 1998, he's impeached. But remember, impeachment doesn't necessarily mean that someone is removed from office. Articles of impeachment are filed to say that something wrong has been done. And then once those have been voted on by the House of Representatives and approved, it goes to the Senate for an actual trial. If the Senate comes back with a guilty verdict, then they are removed from office. So far, we've had 3 presidents impeached: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. Nixon was in the impeachment process when he resigned. But none have been removed from office. Clinton was acquitted in 1999. That same year, Newt Gingrich was caught up in his own scandal. After spending the entire Clinton affair debacle bashing the president for his moral failures, Gingrich himself was caught in an affair and divorced from his wife before the end of the year. So much for an end to scandal. If you're interested in more on the Clinton affair scandal or the Clinton impeachment, I'll have some podcasts linked in Canvas for you to listen to. In the election of 2000, Republican George W. Bush, son of George H.W. Bush, ran against Bill Clinton's Vice President Al Gore. In addition to the 2 major parties, independent candidate Ralph Nader also ran using his own independent wealth. This isn't totally unusual. We saw the same thing with Ross Perot, who pulled in almost a fifth of the popular vote in the 1992 election. In the case of the 2000 election, third parties like Nader had a big impact since the popular and electoral votes were so close. In the end, the election came down to Florida and their 25 electoral votes, and the debate had primarily to do with the inability to determine some of the ballots. Unlike today, where the vast majority of voting is done digitally in some form, the ballots in this case were a form where voters had to use a stylus pen to punch through a card into a piece of paper to choose the candidate they wanted. But in some counties, either the overlaying mechanism that helped people align the paper to the right candidate was flawed or confusing, or people weren't able to punch through the paper completely. This led to what are called hanging chads, which you can see here in the image, where the paper dangles from the sheet. So in some counties, the question was asked, if the paper isn't all the way off the sheet, does this mean that the person maybe hesitated or didn't mean to actually vote for that person? How far off the paper does the punch need to be in order to indicate that a vote was actually cast for someone? And so in Florida, where many of the counties were within a margin of error, they did a manual recount of the votes, which I want to emphasize, especially given the recent 2020 election. It's perfectly fine for a presidential candidate or candidates to go through the legal process of asking for a recount if there's a close margin of error. In most cases, a margin of a certain amount will trigger an automatic recount, which is why news outlets don't call the election for a certain candidate when the vote is close, even if almost all of the ballots are in. And so initially it looked like Bush had won Florida in the election, and so Al Gore called him to concede, as is normal. But then when his team told him he needed to ask for a recount, he called and took back his concession, which isn't really normal, but because the concession isn't a legally mandated thing, it's really just a politeness thing, he's totally within his right to do that. And so they went through weeks of this recounting process before Bush's legal team sent a lawsuit up to the Supreme Court to ask them to make it stop. And with the slim margin in his favor, the Supreme Court did decide to do this. So counting stopped and Bush won the election. And most importantly, when the Supreme Court made their decision, Al Gore accepted it. And in his remarks to the nation immediately following, he said, "This is America, and we put country before party. We stand together behind our new president. I know many of my supporters are disappointed, I am too, but I say to President-elect Bush that what remains of partisan rancor must now be set aside, and may God bless his stewardship of our country." And then he largely stepped out of public view for quite a while so that Bush could take over leadership, which in itself was an incredible act of public service on Gore's part that we don't often see in politics anymore. The political atmosphere that emerged at the end of the 1990s set a foundation for the modern political sphere we have today. Gingrich's tactics in the Republican Party, even after his resignation, continued to push the GOP in the direction of radicalization and right-wing attacks against their own moderate members and any indication of liberal reform. In the Democratic Party, leaders similarly attacked notions of reform that they deemed too liberal for their centrist comfort zone, and fears of attacks of socialism or radical leftism from Republican media machines. And so going into the new millennium, what the American political system had was one party leaning increasingly right, another with left-leaning members who had nowhere to go with their ideas, and a whole slew of centrists either by exile or political expediency.